As I suggested in the last lecture module, I'll break the lecture up into two fundamental chunks corresponding to the two theses, or purposes, as he describes them, of BonJour's paper. And he gives us those right in that first page. He tells us that the purposes of this essay are, first, to distinguish and clarify the main dialectical variants of foundationalism by viewing them as responses to one fundamental problem, which is both the main motivation and the primary obstacle for foundationalism. And second, to offer schematic reasons for doubting whether any version of foundationalism is finally acceptable. Turning our attention then to that first thesis, or as BonJour describes it, purpose. And in some sense, purpose is a quite apt description of what he's trying to accomplish there, because his goal in this first part of the paper is to frame the issue, to expand upon the idea of foundationalism in such a way that it fits well within the framework of his criticisms of the view in this paper and of his advocacy of his alternative conception of justification, coherentism, in the next paper that we're going to look at. And there's nothing deviant about the way that he does this, really. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward and pretty traditional, the way he introduces and discusses foundationalism as a view about justification, at least within the 20th century. And he does introduce foundationalism using this epistemic regress argument. And this argument is definitely the central argument that is offered up by defenders of foundationalism in the 20th century. The epistemic regress argument, then, is an argument we need to look at in some detail and understand how it operates to establish both its regress and to establish foundationalism as the de facto sole alternative theory of justification, and hence the correct theory of justification, assuming that we have knowledge at all. Now, BonJour does talk about the epistemic regress argument and discusses it in some detail in this paper. He'll do that again in the next paper that we look at, but he doesn't talk about regress arguments or their mechanisms in general. And so I want to take a little time as an aside, as it were, to look at the first cause or cosmological argument, another regress argument, and to talk about the common mechanisms of these arguments in virtue of which they create their regresses and the conclusions that they use, the mechanisms by which they attempt to then derive their conclusions. And we'll see that they do have common mechanisms to create regresses, and they have a common goal as well, to establish an alternative that violates their mechanistic assumptions that generate the regress itself. So we'll want to look at that carefully. BonJour correctly says that foundationalism motivates its own acceptance by articulating this problem in the epistemic regress argument, which he labels the epistemic regress problem. And so you want to understand what that problem is and how it arises out of our epistemic regress argument. And we'll also want to understand what it is that foundationalism introduces as the sole viable solution, it claims and argues, for our epistemic regress problem. And for BonJour, that gets characterized as non-inferential justification, but we know it as, and he discusses it quite often as, the notion of a basic belief. That is, the notion of a belief that doesn't get its justification via the transference of justification through inference from other beliefs that previously had justification, but that gets its justification intrinsically or in a way that is not related to other beliefs. All foundationalism, every version of foundationalism, relies on this notion of a basic belief and uses it to provide a mechanism whereby justificatory regresses can be terminated in justification, hence granting justification to every belief that is in that regress in that sequence, and hence providing this distinction and mechanism whereby we have this set of uniquely originally justified beliefs from which all other beliefs get their justification. Now, how we delineate the requirements that we put upon a belief in order to count as basic versus a non-basic belief, that can be different from one version of foundationalism to another. And so BonJour will use that distinction. What is required in order to be basic within a particular foundationalist view to articulate two different versions of foundationalism. The first one he calls strong foundationalism, and I note that his strong foundationalism actually poses fewer requirements. It's less stringent in terms of what counts as a basic belief than the foundationalism that we found in Descartes, and hence I make that distinction here between what he calls strong foundationalism, or I refer to as a modest strong foundationalism, and classic strong foundationalism. He then talks about how we can weaken further the requirements on basicness, and we can come up with what he refers to as weak foundationalism. And so we'll turn our attention in the next lecture module to walking our way through each of these points.